Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Shahzadeh Kamar, and this is our video lecture number 5. I am one of the faculty member in USA Lahore. In this lecture, the aggregate expenditure model, we assume that the chapter begins with the closed economy in which we have no export, import, or government sector. But afterwards, we will also include export and import at the government expenditure to see how it affects on the aggregate expenditures. So we will also assume that prices are fixed, at least sticky downwards, so that we can focus on the real GDP, because the real GDP and the nominal GDP, they have the difference of the prices. We assume the Keynesian developed the model during the 1930s, and it helps explain how the modern economies adjust to the economic shocks. Where we are also assuming the closed economy with no government or the foreign trade, so that's why the GDP is equal to the national income or the personal income or disposable income. All of these are same. So we begin with the private closed economy, consumption spending and investment spending. In this slide, we have the two different types of the diagrams. One of them is called the investment demand curve, which is negatively sloped. Investment is determined by the rate of interest. The higher the rate of interest, the lesser the investment, and vice versa. In diagram B, investment schedule which is fixed as given in the diagram A, $20 billion rupees. This is fixed irrespective of the real GDP. The real GDP is low or high. It has no concern with the investment schedule. It is fixed. This is also one of the assumptions. This figure shows the equilibrium GDP in a closed economy. Equilibrium GDP is basically determined where aggregate expenditure intersects the 45-degree line, that is 470 over here. And this diagram that illustrates the changes in aggregate expenditure and multiplier effect. An increase in aggregate expenditure will increase real GDP, and changes in GDP depends on the multiplier. Now we are going to add the international trade. Now we are moving from the closed economy to the open economy, and we will see that including net export spending in aggregate expenditures. This is a private open economy. Private means because there is no government sector, so therefore we call it's open economy, but there is no government sectors there. And net exports basically affect aggregate expenditure in an open economy. If the net exports are positive, it will increase aggregate expenditure, and it has expansionary effect on the economy. Exports will create production, employment, and income. And if the net exports xn is negative, obviously it will reduce aggregate expenditure, and it has a deflationary, recessionary effect on the economy. This figure that shows the impact of the net export on GDP. If our net export is positive, that is xn1 over here, it will elevate the aggregate expenditure. And if our net export is negative, that is shown over here, is xn2, it will lower the aggregate expenditure, and it will be having a multiple effect on the real GDP. It will definitely reduce it. Prosperity abroad, that if the other countries are happy, they are having more higher income, they are leading a prosperous life, then it will definitely increase our exports. If our exchange rate is depreciating, that it will also have a positive impact on the exports because the world will find our products more cheaper due to the depreciation of the rupees, so they will demand more of our products. But a caution on tariff and devaluations, other countries they can retaliate because artificially, if we are reducing our rupee and we are making our product more cheaper, then we will be more competitive with the rest of the world. So that definitely they will retaliate if our rupee's value has gone down. And obviously, if our rupee value goes down, it will also the lower GDP for all of us. Okay, now we are adding the public sector. Tax collections, we will assume are constant and independent of the GDP level. And we know that increase in taxes has indirect effect on aggregate expenditure because the taxes reduces disposable income and the consumption by the amount of the tax times MPC. So taxes are basically subject to the multiplier and disposable income is equal to GDP. The lump sum tax we talk about, it has no concern with the amount of the tax is independent of the GDP. This figure basically illustrates the impact of the government expenditure on GDP. If the government expenditure will increase, aggregate expenditure will also increase and it has impact on GDP by the amount of the multiple effect. The multiplier over here is 4. If you look at this, the 470 and then 550. 80 billion rupees is the amount of the GDP which has gone up by the government spending of 20 billion. So it means the 80 divided by 20, the 4 is the multiplier. This figure is reflecting the impact of the taxes on GDP. If our MPC is 0.75, that means 20 billion of taxes will reduce consumption by 15. How? Because the 20 multiplied by MPC, which is 0.75, and if you multiply 20 by 0.75, the answer is C. So the impact of tax is dependent on the MPC. So, and we will see 490 and 550. How much is the amount of fall in GDP? Is by 60 billion. So we can say if the government is imposing tax, it will reducing the consumption because obviously the tax will reduce the consumption by 15, and if the multiplier is 4, so it means a fall in the GDP is by the amount of 60 billion rupees. So the equilibrium that would occur where consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net export is equal to the GDP. Discretionary expenditure gap that is exist when aggregate expenditure is falling short of the full employment GDP. So it means our aggregate expenditure is not sufficient to reach at the full employment GDP. It will result in a fall in the output and unemployment that would increase because we are spending below the full employment GDP. And solution is that we have to increase our government expenditure or decrease the taxes to boost up our recessionary gap. On the other hand, if you look at the inflationary gap, It means that our aggregate expenditure is exceeding full employment GDP. We are spending too much. So spending exceeds the full employment GDP, which is called the inflationary gap, and it will result in the demand pull inflation. So in order to cope with it, we will have to decrease our government expenditures or we will have to increase our taxes. In this figure, we'll see the 5 billion gap that causes a 20 billion GDP gap. 490 and 510. The difference is 20 billion. If we are going to have the recessionary expenditure gap is 5 billion, that means our aggregate expenditure is less than full employment GDP by the amount of the 5 billion. So that gap will result in fall in the real GDP by the amount of $20 billion. In this diagram, we'll see the 5 billion inflationary gap is resulting overspending produces the demand pull inflation and our GDP that has gone up by the amount of the 20 billion rupees. And the last, the Say's law, Great Depression, Keynes, because before the 1930s, before the Keynes, people they used to believe in the classicists that all the uh, economies are self-equilibrating, self-adjusting. In case of any discrepancy, the economy will automatically adjust. In case if there is overproduction, then prices will reduce automatically and it will remove all the gap. So economy was based on the laissez-faire. But in the 1930s, Keynes proved that the producers they responded to unsold inventories by decreasing output, not by reducing in prices. According to the classicist, if there are the inventories are piled up, then a fall in the price will automatically that will remove the piled up inventories. But actually, indeed, it didn't happen in the 1930s. So classicists have failed because the producers they responding to unsold inventories by falling output, rather decreasing the prices. Keynes proved that the prices and wages are at least sticky downwards. So he's of the view, Keynes is of the view, the cyclical unemployment that occurs in any case, economy is not self-adjusting, the inventories can be piled up, unemployment can exist for longer time. So there is need for the government to take the action to intervene in order to correct because economies are not self-adjusting like the classicist says. So this was the Keynesian school of thought which matches with the modern economies. Thank you very much.